For 4 weeks, I worked in the farmhouse my daughter's fiancé was renovating, and the entire time he called me the craftsman, without once asking my last name. He handed me coffee some mornings, the way you hand a mug to someone standing in your kitchen, who you have not yet decided to look at directly. I told myself it didn't matter. I had been invisible on job sites before. I was 67 years old, and I knew how to wear a tool belt like armor. What I hadn't known, not until the Thursday afternoon I heard him in the mudroom on the phone, was that the man calling me the craftsman was also the man who planned to take everything my wife had left behind for our daughter. This is how it started. My name is Gordon Reeves. I spent 41 years building custom cabinetry and furniture out of a small shop in Lawrenceville, 3 miles east of downtown Pittsburgh, and I retired the month after my wife Frances died. That was 2 winters ago. Frances had breast cancer for 3 years, and we knew it was coming, the way you know a storm is coming when the pressure drops and the dog won't settle. The knowledge sits in your chest, and you wait, and you do whatever you can with the time you still have. Frances had a cedar hope chest she'd kept at the foot of our bed since before we were married. It was the first piece of real furniture I ever made her, the summer before our wedding, green as I was, working evenings in my father's garage with second-hand tools and wood I'd bought on sale. The joinery was rough. The lid didn't sit perfectly flat. She kept it anyway for 34 years and told anyone who admired it that her husband had built it when he was 26 and didn't know what he was doing yet. She said it with a kind of pride that still undoes me if I think about it too long. After she passed, our daughter Ivy took the cedar chest to her apartment in Shadyside. I understood. It had always been as much hers as ours. I also had Frances's garden notebook, the worn spiral thing she'd used for years to track what she'd planted and when. The last entries were from April of her final spring. Tomatoes, black-eyed Susans, the climbing ivy along the back fence that she'd planted the summer our daughter was born and named for it. I hadn't been able to put that notebook anywhere but the kitchen drawer, right next to a grocery list in her handwriting from 2019, the last year she'd been well enough to cook big meals. The call came from my former apprentice, Gary, who had taken over my shop when I retired. He said a client of his, some kind of private equity professional, was renovating a property out in Sewickley, a 100-year-old farmhouse with good bones, and the client wanted custom built-ins in the study and main hallway. Gary had too many active contracts to take it. He'd told the client he knew someone. I'm retired, I told Gary. He said the client was paying well, and the farmhouse was 20 minutes from my house in Shaler. I said, send me the address. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel lane off Route 65, a 2-story white clapboard with a covered porch and deep-set windows that caught the November light and held it, the kind of place built by people who expected it to outlast them. The client's name, I was told, was Reed Calloway, 34 years old, worked in private equity, very particular about specifications. He shook my hand when I arrived and immediately began talking about the study, gesturing at the walls with the authority of a man who had read enough about renovation to know the vocabulary but had never picked up a chisel. I nodded when it made sense and asked about moisture levels and subfloor conditions. He looked slightly impatient at the questions, the way people do when they've decided what they want and prefer not to hear about the thing standing between them and it. He came to the site 2 or 3 times a week. He walked through the rooms the way I had seen hundreds of clients walk through rooms, looking at a thing without seeing it. He called me the craftsman in the third person, even when I was standing directly in front of him. He said things like, has the craftsman had a chance to look at the hallway alcove? To the general contractor he sometimes brought along, a man named Boyd, who had the permanent expression of someone calculating how long until he could leave. Boyd would look at me, and I would answer the question directly, and Reed would nod at Boyd, as if the information had been relayed through proper channels. I was not angry. I was familiar with the species. In 41 years of working in other people's spaces, I had been treated as background more times than I could count. What I had learned was that invisibility, if you carry it correctly, is information. People say things in front of craftsmen and tradespeople that they would never say in front of peers. They treat you like furniture, and furniture hears everything. The first time I noticed something off was a Wednesday afternoon at the end of my second week. Reed came in and walked through the study, where I was installing the first panel of built-ins, moving with the quick efficiency I had come to expect. But when he reached the window that looked out over the south field, he stopped and took out his phone and photographed the view, not the interior. The view, the field, the tree line, the access road below. Then he went to the corner and photographed the interior dimensions from wall to wall. The way you document square footage for a real estate listing, rather than for a home you're about to move into. I kept working. I made a note of it. The second time was the following Tuesday. He came in during lunch, and stood in the hallway on a phone call while I was returning from my truck. His voice carried in the empty house the way voices do when a man isn't thinking about what the walls can hold. I heard him say, the comps on Route 65 have moved 12% in 18 months. If we hold it 2 years after transfer, you're looking at a very different conversation. A pause. No, the family situation takes care of itself after the wedding. That's already in motion. I set my toolbox down carefully and went back to work. The third time put ice in my blood in a way I had not felt since the oncologist told us about the scan results. It was a Thursday afternoon in the mudroom off the back kitchen. I was running cable for under-cabinet lighting, 15 feet from the open doorway, when Reed came in on another call. His back was to me. His voice was low, but not low enough for an empty house. He said my daughter's name. Ivy's not going to push back on anything structural. I've spent 8 months making sure of that. A pause. No, the trust distributes through the estate. Her mother set it up before she passed. Ivy's told me the whole picture when we got serious. She doesn't know I pulled the paperwork. Another pause, then a short, confident laugh. The old man's not in the picture. Ivy said they barely talk. Once we're married, the timing works itself out. I was holding a cable connector in my left hand. My right hand was pressed flat against the underside of the cabinet above me. I did not move, not because I was afraid, because I needed every word to settle fully before I trusted myself to do anything at all. Ivy, my daughter, 29 years old, working in nonprofit management in Shadyside. Named for the climbing vine Frances had planted the summer she was born. Frances's only child. The primary beneficiary of the revocable living trust our estate attorney had set up when the diagnosis first came. A trust designed to ensure that what we had built over 4 decades of work reached Ivy cleanly, protected, intact. A trust I had not discussed broadly. A trust this man had apparently pulled the paperwork on without Ivy's knowledge. I walked to my truck. I sat behind the wheel and looked at my hands in my lap, and I thought about Frances, who used to say, "Gordon, when something scares you this badly, that means you have to be twice as careful." I was scared badly. That evening I called my old friend Morris Webb. Morris had been a general contractor in Pittsburgh for 30 years and knew half the trades community and a fair portion of the legal one. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything. I talked for a long time. When I finished, Morris said, "Gordon, are you absolutely certain it's Ivy he's talking about?" "There's only one Ivy in my life," I said. A silence, then "Tell me his full name." I drove home through the river valley and sat at the kitchen table in Shaler, Frances's table, the one we'd found at an estate sale in Millvale and refinished in the garage over a long October weekend and declared the best $30 we'd ever spent. I opened the kitchen drawer and took out her garden notebook. I turned to the back pages, blank since April of her last spring, and I wrote down everything I'd heard, word for word, dated and timed. Then I put the notebook in my chest pocket and went to bed. I didn't sleep much. In the days that followed, I went back to the farmhouse and I built things. I built them carefully and well, because the work was real even when everything around it had become something I hadn't anticipated. Reed came by that Friday with a man I hadn't seen before, mid-40s, dressed like a bank officer. They spoke in the shorthand of people who had been planning something together for a long while. The other man looked at the built-ins I'd completed and said they were impressive. He said it to Reed, not to me. Reed said they were exactly what he'd specified. The following Tuesday, Reed came alone. He set a folder on the kitchen counter and opened it with the ease of a man who had rehearsed the presentation before arriving. "My fiancé and I have been working with an attorney on our estate planning," he said. His voice was warm, professionally warm, the warmth that comes from a script rather than a feeling. "Part of that is making sure the people in our family have the right structures in place." He pointed to a page. My name was already printed in clean black type on the signature line. "This is a financial power of attorney. It would allow your daughter to act on your behalf if you ever need assistance, medical decisions, property matters, financial management. Very standard for families with generational assets." I looked at the document. I did not touch it. "Gordon," Reed said, and the fact that he used my first name for the first time in 4 weeks was not lost on me. "Ivy loves you. She worries about you handling everything alone since her mother passed. This is just her way of making sure you're taken care of." I looked up from the document and looked at him directly for what felt like the first time. He met my eyes with the steady confidence of a man expecting me to reach for a pen. "Who prepared this?" I said. "Our estate attorney. He specializes in multi-generational planning." "Has Ivy reviewed this specific document?" A pause, brief, almost invisible. "We've discussed the general framework." That was not a yes. I knew the construction of that sentence for exactly what it was. "I'll have my own attorney look at anything before I sign it," I said. My voice came out level as a freshly planed surface. That's just how I've always done things. I'm sure you understand. His expression didn't break, but something behind his eyes adjusted, a small, cold recalculation. The look of a man doing arithmetic and not liking what the numbers returned. Of course, he said. He closed the folder and left. Before I tell you what happened when my daughter sat down at Francis's kitchen table and I spread that garden notebook open between us. Drop a number in the comments right now. Any number. Just let me know you're still here. And a note before we continue. What comes next is the part I've had the hardest time telling, because it required me to look at something about myself I'd been avoiding. If you're watching for a clean story about a man who catches the bad guy and delivers justice, you'll get some of that. But you'll also hear about where I let my daughter down long before Reed Calloway ever showed up. That part matters too. Stay with me. Morris called on a Saturday morning in early December. I was looking at the ice on the birch tree Francis had planted the year we moved in. His voice had the measured quality he used when something needed to be handled with precision. "Gordon," he said, "she's not the first." He told me about a woman in Columbus. 58 years old, recently widowed. Her late husband had owned a small portfolio of commercial rental properties, the kind of steady, unglamorous asset that accumulates value over 30 years of careful management. She met Reed Calloway at a charity event. Within 6 months, he was a fixture in her life. By month 10, he was managing her rental accounts. By month 14, he had co-signatory access to her business operating account, structured as a tax efficiency measure by his attorney. By month 18, the relationship was over, and within 30 days she discovered that a significant sum in rent payments had been redirected through 2 intermediary accounts to a name she had never heard. She filed a civil complaint in Franklin County. Reed's attorneys responded within a week, the speed of people prepared for exactly this. The counterclaim stated that every transaction had been authorized. The case settled 8 weeks later, dismissal by stipulation, mutual confidentiality agreement. Under the terms, neither party could discuss the dispute, the allegations, or the outcome. If she talked, she could be sued for breach. "He walks away clean," I said. Morris said, "The confidentiality agreement isn't just protection, Gordon. It's a lock on the only person who could have warned the next one." I pressed the heel of my hand against my mouth and held it there until the feeling that was trying to become something I couldn't control backed down enough to let me think. This was not a young man who had made a mistake and learned from it. This was a methodology, a documented, repeatable methodology with legal architecture built around it. That evening I called my daughter. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and a little rushed. I asked how she was. She told me about her week. Then I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether she and Reed had been working with an estate attorney lately. A pause. "Dad, Reed mentioned you two had spoken at the site. About some paperwork?" Her voice had the careful quality she used when she was trying to understand the shape of something before reacting. I said, "Come to the house Saturday. There are some things I want to show you. Just come." She came. She hung her coat on the hook by the door, the same hook she'd used since she was 7 years old. She sat in her chair at the kitchen table, the one with the slightly uneven leg that Francis had always meant to fix and never did. I put soup in front of her because I didn't know what else to do with my hands while I looked for the words. We ate, we talked about small things. Then Ivy set her spoon down and looked at me with Francis's eyes, gray-green and direct, the kind that don't give you room to deflect, and said, "Show me, Dad." I opened the kitchen drawer and took out Francis's garden notebook. I laid it on the table, and I told her everything, in order from the first morning at the farmhouse to the afternoon. Reed had placed a document with my name, pre-printed on the signature line in front of me, and told me my daughter had sent it. I told her about the phone call in the mudroom. I told her what Morris had found about Columbus. When I read her the exact words I had written down, "Evie's not going to push back on anything structural. I've spent 8 months making sure of that." She put both hands over her face. Her shoulders held still through an effort I recognized, because I had been making the same effort for 6 weeks. When she lowered her hands, her eyes were wet, and her jaw was set, and she was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen in 2 years. Not grief. Clarity. "Why didn't you just call me the first night?" she said. Her voice was quiet and honest in the way she had always been honest with me, even when it cost her something. I looked at my daughter across Francis's table. "Because he had been building for 8 months before I walked into that farmhouse," I said. "He had been establishing a version of me in your mind, the distant father, the one who withdrew after your mother died. He had been preparing you, so that if I raised concerns, it would sound exactly like what he'd described. A grieving old man who couldn't let go. I needed you to have something real in your hands, something he couldn't explain away before you'd had time to look at it. I touched the garden notebook between us. Ivy reached out and opened it. She turned the pages slowly, her mother's handwriting on the early pages, tomatoes and black-eyed Susans, and the climbing ivy by the back fence, and then my handwriting filling the pages at the back, dates and exact words, everything I'd been afraid I would lose before I could give it to her. When she reached the last entry, she closed the notebook and held it against her chest with both arms, the way Frances used to hold things that were heavy and also hers. We sat at that table for 2 hours. We talked about her mother, about the trust and what it had been designed to protect, about the woman in Columbus who was legally forbidden from warning anyone else. When we were done, Ivy looked at me and said, "The engagement party is next weekend. I want you there." I looked at her steadily. "Are you still asking me to come?" She set the garden notebook on the table between us, Frances's handwriting face up. "I'm asking, Dad." The restaurant was on the North Shore, small and warm, exposed brick and candlelight, and the sound of people actually talking to each other. I arrived early and took a seat against the wall. Morris was at the bar. I'd asked him to come, and he'd said yes without needing an explanation, which is what 40 years of friendship looks like. Reed's mother arrived in a wine-colored blazer. She saw me across the room and did a rapid assessment before her smile arrived. I nodded. She nodded back. Two people who understood the shape of the evening without having agreed on it. Reed worked the room with the ease of someone who had done this his whole adult life. When he reached me, he shook my hand, and it was as good to have me there, that Ivy talked about me constantly, that he was glad we were getting to know each other better. His eyes, while he said all of this, were measuring me with the same cold arithmetic I'd seen in the farmhouse kitchen. I smiled and said I was glad to be there. Ivy arrived last. She crossed the room to me first, before going to Reed, and put her arms around me the way she had when she was small, and something had frightened her. I held on as long as she did, and not 1 second less. Dinner was served. The room softened into conversation. For 40 minutes, everything looked like what it appeared to be. Then Reed stood and lifted his glass. He thanked everyone for coming. He said something gracious about Ivy, about their future together, about the farmhouse. He looked at me and said he was grateful for the craftsmanship, that every time he walked through that hallway, he thought about the care put into it. He raised his glass to me. I set mine down. I stood up quietly. The room went still. "Thank you, Reed," I said. "I'd like to say something if that's all right." He kept his glass raised, his smile held. Behind his eyes, something small and cold began to work. I looked at my daughter. She gave me one small nod. "I spent 4 weeks in that farmhouse before Reed knew I was Ivy's father," I said. "I came in every morning and built what the plans called for, and the whole time I paid attention to what else that house was being prepared to hold." I reached into my jacket and placed Frances's garden notebook on the table. This belonged to my wife. She used it to keep track of everything she was trying to protect. The last 40 pages I wrote myself. I looked at Ivy. "This is yours, sweetheart. You decide what to do with it." My daughter reached across the table and took the notebook with steady hands. I looked at Reed. "I have lost things I cannot replace," I said. "I know what that costs. But a family that loses trust is not as easy to repair as a farmhouse. You can strip a farmhouse back to the framing and start over. What holds a family together can't be rerouted through an intermediary account. Once it's gone, it has to be rebuilt from whatever's left, one true thing at a time." I looked at my daughter one last time. "Your mother believed that. I believe it, and I believe in you." The table was very quiet. Reed's mother pressed her fingers to her lips. Her eyes moved between her son and Ivy with the rapid recalculation of a woman whose assumptions were collapsing in real time. Reed looked at Ivy. His composure, the extraordinary practiced composure of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again, was fracturing at the edges. I could see it in his jaw, in the way his hands had come to rest flat on the table. "Evie," he said quietly, just her name. Ivy looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were around Frances's notebook, steady and deliberate, the way you hold something that is both heavy and yours. "I need time," she said. He flinched, a full, visible flinch, the first completely unmanaged thing I had ever seen from a man who managed everything. He pushed back from the table. He straightened his jacket with a precise, habitual gesture. He looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes in that last second was not fury. It was the exhaustion of someone who has been performing without rest for a very long time and has just heard the curtain coming down. He walked out. His mother followed. The door closed. Morris stood at the other end of the table and said something about the dessert menu that made the room breathe again and find its footing. Ivy sat with the notebook against her chest and looked at me across the space where Reed had been. Stay, Dad, she said. Her voice was raw and real and entirely her own. I'm not going anywhere, I said. We stayed until they turned the lights up. We talked about her mother, about the cedar chest at the foot of Ivy's bed, about the trust Francis had set up and what it had been built to do, about what it means to protect someone versus what it means to trust them. Those are not the same thing, and it took me 67 years to fully understand the difference. Walking out into the December cold, Ivy put her hand through my arm the way she used to on Saturday mornings when she was a teenager, and we'd walk the strip district while Francis slept in. Her hand was warm even through my coat. I'm sorry I didn't come to you sooner, I told her, about everything, not just this. She leaned her head against my shoulder for exactly 1 second, then she straightened. You came, she said. That's what matters. The river was dark and still below us, and the city lights caught it in long broken lines that went all the way to the other bank. People ask me sometimes what I took away from all of this. I tell them the same thing every time. I learned that the things we build with our hands can last a lifetime if we build them right. The things we build out of silence, the careful distance, the grief we carry alone, because we think we're protecting someone, those have a much shorter life than we'd like to believe. I waited 6 weeks when I should have called my daughter the first night. I told myself I needed evidence. I told myself she had to be ready to hear it. Some of that was true, but some of it was what I have always done when something frightens me. I reach for the work instead of the person. I document instead of connect. A man who only shows up with a full case file is not fully showing up. Ivy has Francis's cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She has her mother's garden notebook on the shelf above her desk. She has a father who finally learned, at 67 years old, that showing up matters more than showing up prepared. She calls on Sundays now, real calls, not weather reports. If this story reminded you of someone you love, someone you've been meaning to call, something you've been meaning to say, I hope you'll set this down for a minute and do that. Right now, before the moment passes. I read every comment, and I'm glad you stayed all the way to the end. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. There's more where it came from. And one small note before you go. Some of the details in these stories are fictionalized to protect privacy and to illustrate a lesson that is very real. The lesson is the part that matters. Thank you for being here.